Gather around as we spill the tea on cybersecurity. We're talking about the topic in a way that everyone can understand. I'm your host, Jara Rowe, giving you just what you need. This is the Tea on Cybersecurity, a podcast from Trava. Welcome to the Tea on Cybersecurity. You are listening to the compliance segment of this season. So far, we've gone over some of the confusing terminology, the different frameworks and certifications, but on this episode, we are diving into a crucial topic, vulnerability management and its direct impact on security compliance. Jim Goldman will be helping us understand why vulnerability management matters and why businesses can't afford to overlook it. Let's jump into it. Hi, Jim.
Hey, Jara. It's great to be here again.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you help me and the listeners understand this topic.
Great. Let's do it.
Can you provide a brief overview of what vulnerability management is and why it's crucial to cybersecurity in general?
Like many of the topics we've spoken about on these podcasts, I always like to demystify the vocabulary and say, okay, there's nothing specifically overly technical or overwhelming about a given vocabulary word, in this case, vulnerability management. So I like to use an analogy that has nothing to do with cybersecurity. So the concept of vulnerability management in many ways is universal. And so if we think about it in a physical sense, try to keep our homes or our businesses secure from a physical sense, it's what are the vulnerabilities? Leaving your doors unlocked, leaving your windows unlocked, leaving a candle lit and then leaving the house and going somewhere. Those are vulnerabilities. What's vulnerability management mean? It's like anything else, with cybersecurity, it's like any other type of vulnerability management. And I think as we'll get into later, there are multiple stages. The best thing you can do is to prevent vulnerabilities, right? If you can't prevent them, then you certainly need to detect them reliably. And then once you detect them, you have to have a method to respond and recover, etc. And so I think that's probably the most important introductory comment we can make, just because cybersecurity vulnerabilities do have a technical side. That doesn't mean that vulnerability management as a process is necessarily all that tech. Take it to cybersecurity. What's the equivalent of leaving your door unlocked in cybersecurity? It's not having your networks properly protected. It's not having multi-factor authentication. It could be as simple as you're in a public place and you're using public Wi-Fi and you go to use the restroom and leave your laptop open and logged in, things like that. That's the equivalent of the unlocked door or the unlocked.
So now that we have a better understanding of vulnerability management, I would love to bring compliance into the conversation. What role do regular vulnerability like assessments and management practices play in meeting compliance standards?
The word that comes to mind is fundamental. In other words, you really can't be compliant to any given standard, whether or not you want to get certified. Our audience is probably now familiar with terms like SOC 2 certification, ISO certification, etc. You cannot get certified to those compliance standards, or even if you're not interested in certification, even have a legitimate cybersecurity program if it doesn't start with vulnerability management. So it's almost like foundational, Jara. That's the bottom line. If you do nothing else, you have to start there. Because think about it, otherwise you're flying blind. If you don't even know what your problems are, and your problems are your vulnerabilities, how can you fix it?
We've talked about that on a couple episodes as well. You can't protect what you don't know, but how are you ever going to know what's there if you're not looking for it?
What occurs to me is you bought a house not long ago, and I'm sure you had a home inspection. What's a home inspection when you come right down to it? It's a vulnerability assessment. So you end up with a whole list, and then you prioritize. It's the same thing in cybersecurity vulnerability management. You end up with a whole list of vulnerabilities, and you decide based on your budget, your time, what we call mitigating controls. I can wait on that one. I can't wait on that one. One by one, tick off your vulnerabilities. That's what we're doing here.
How do vulnerabilities in a system relate to compliance requirements?
let's go back to a couple examples like the SOC 2 certification or ISO certification. Both of those have whole what are called control areas or control families related to vulnerability management. It's really best practices if you come right down to it. In each of those standards, there are defined processes that you have to be able to show evidence that you're doing steps to have a comprehensive vulnerability management system, process, if you will. And it really goes back to those generic stages that I mentioned before: vulnerability prevention, vulnerability detection, vulnerability response, recovery, continuous improvement. In other words, do you have a methodology in place so that the same vulnerability, you're not playing whack-a-mole, as we sometimes say. You see a vulnerability, you fix it, and then a month later the same vulnerability shows up. That's not good. That's not continuous improvement. That's not a comprehensive security program that the compliance standards that you referred to earlier really expect to see.
Can you elaborate on how compliance involves detailed documentation of security processes and practices, especially in terms of documenting how vulnerabilities are identified, assessed, and then mitigated?
When it comes to certification and compliance, kind of the critical last step is the audit. And there's usually an internal audit, and then there's an external audit with a third party. In the case of SOC 2, it's a CPA firm. In the case of ISO, it's certified ISO auditors. So these are third parties that are going to come in. Now, as much as they'd like to take your word for it, that you're doing this, that, or the other thing, they can only make an assessment based on objective evidence. And so to your point about the need for documentation in this whole process, it really starts with policies. In other words, what does your continuous vulnerability management policy looks like? What you have to put in that policy is, here's what we promise we'll do. Here's what we intend to do. That's kind of the say what you do piece. Then the next piece is the do what you say. So that's where the processes come in. We do this. We gather evidence to prove we do it. We store that evidence. We archive that evidence. We preserve that evidence. And it is that evidence that the auditors then come in and look at. And it has to be like over a period of time, whether it's 3 months or 6 months or 9 months or a year. Auditors are going to want to see that you said this was a continuous, that's the key word there, this is a continuous vulnerability management program. They're going to want to see evidence that shows that continuity over time, that this is a consistent process, and more importantly, that you've got like a management or a monitoring layer over that process so that you know if there was an exception, so that if you missed the scan or that there was a vulnerability of a certain criticality, let's say it was a critical vulnerability, and your service level agreement, SLA, is any critical vulnerability will be fixed in 7 days or less. And in this case, it wasn't. You need to have a system in place that raises an alert, raises an alarm, sends an email, whatever. You've got to be able to show evidence that here's what we said we were going to do. In this case, we didn't do it, but we got documentation. We knew it. The alert went off. Here's the exception, et cetera. It's just you have to have that tightly managed process, and you have to have evidence that you're really serious about doing this, sort of by the book, if you will, according to your policy, and you have evidence to
Jim, you've mentioned continuous improvement a couple of times. Can you just define what that is for the listeners that may be unfamiliar with that?
A lot of times in cybersecurity, there's no such thing as maintaining the status quo. In other words, we have adversaries in cybersecurity. You have to know that and accept that. So you're either gaining or you're losing to your adversaries at any point in time. There's no such thing as standing still. And so continuous improvement is a vital concept to a legitimate cybersecurity program, because you can't just maintain the status quo. You always, anytime in this case where there's a vulnerability, a new vulnerability that you discovered. You have to mitigate that vulnerability, but then in any kind of vulnerability management program or incident response program, you always have to do this kind of after action review, which says, what could we have done differently to prevent this from happening? Or what do we need to do differently in the future to prevent this from reoccurring? That's that key continuous improvement piece. Now, how you document that, maybe you need a change in policy. Maybe you need a change just in the process or procedure. Maybe you need to change a configuration on one of the tools you have. We don't know, but the point is you're always striving to get better.
What are some common compliance standards that organizations need to adhere to? And then how do these standards address vulnerability management? I feel like you were definitely touching on this earlier, but if you could dive into that a little more, that'd be super helpful.
Be easier to say this as a blanket statement, and then I'll talk a little bit more specifically. I don't know of a security or privacy compliance standard that doesn't have as its foundation vulnerability management. So in other words, it's almost the foundation of, said differently, it's like the foundation of any and all security and privacy compliance standards. Because if you think about the well-known privacy ones like GDPR or CCPA, it's really about protecting personal information. What's fundamental to protecting personal information? Sure, it may be encryption or permissions or things like that. But at the end of the day, the technical protection is that you need to be on top of any vulnerabilities that could affect those systems where that personal information is stored. Think about personal information in the old sense of paper files in file folders. And so all your personal information's in a file folder. And that file folder gets stored in a file box and gets stored in a warehouse. What are the physical controls in that case to protect that warehouse, protect that box that your file folder is in? Those are the vulnerabilities that we need to worry about. The fact that it's digital now doesn't change anything. If we're trying to protect personal information, it's like, how could an unauthorized individual get access to that personal information? It's through vulnerabilities. That's why I say vulnerability management is fundamental to the protection of information.
We understand now that vulnerability management is in every, like you mentioned, fundamental in every standard regulation. It should just be there. When does vulnerability management come into play during the certification process, which I understand now could be very lengthy?
It is like the very first thing we do. It almost goes back to the home inspection thing. In order to understand what you're getting yourself into and what gaps need to be closed, what things need to be fixed, we call it a baseline cyber risk assessment. And a big part of that is to do a complete vulnerability scan of every aspect of your information system: applications, data, cloud, network, employees' laptops, and on. We're looking for vulnerabilities where we're literally inspecting. It's the equivalent of inspecting every system in a home. We're inspecting every aspect of your information system, looking for vulnerabilities. It's literally step one or step zero, whatever you want to call it. The truth of your situation, you can't fix anything.
So that goes back to, you can't protect what you don't know, so you have to do that. What are like essential components of a vulnerability management program, and then how does that relate to cybersecurity and compliance in general?
The program itself, the way we usually talk about any kind of program is people, there's process, and technology. And so let's talk about the process first, because I alluded to that before. The process always starts with policies. Those policies then break down into processes or procedures. Those procedures are then implemented on a combination of different technologies, so it makes its way down. You then need qualified people above that to not only follow those policies and procedures and operate that technology, but then you need that layer of management or monitoring to making sure everything's being done according to the defined policies and procedures. And then obviously you have the combination of technology that, doing the actual identification of the vulnerabilities, in some cases mitigating the vulnerabilities, that type of thing. So it's those three elements. It's the people layer, it's the process layer, and it's the technology layer that combine to make that comprehensive program.
Speaking of technology, are there specific tools or technologies that you recommend for vulnerability scanning, assessment, management?
A shameless plug, obviously the Trava platform does a great job at vulnerability identification. One of the things that we've done is combine in one platform many different scans. I think we've got 12 different scans, both internal scans and external scans in our platform. The beauty of that is if you weren't to use the Trava platform with all those scans in one place, you'd probably need to use 3 or 4 or 6 different tools in order to do that number of scans. The problem with that is now you've got different scoring mechanisms on each of those tools. They all run differently, and someone's going to have to take all those results and correlate them into that equivalent of the home inspection report. So think about a home inspection. If you had to hire 6 home inspectors, one to check your roof, one to check your plumbing, one to check your et cetera, and then somebody had to pull together all those results into one report, that's the way vulnerability management is often done with all these different tools. What Trava does is we're one home inspector when it comes to vulnerability management. We do all the scans. We automatically generate one report, and we've normalized all the scoring and rationalized all the scoring. So it's one scoring mechanism for all the different scans. You can literally see, okay, here's the scariest thing that I need to fix first.
That definitely has to be super helpful for our customers, because I can't imagine having a different expert or a different company having to come in for each thing I needed checked out before I purchased the home. So, what are some common challenges that organizations typically face when it comes to implementing vulnerability management?
One that occurs right off the top of my head, and this kind of goes back to the Trava platform, is a lot of vulnerability tools will just identify a vulnerability, but it won't tell you how to fix it. And so it's great. You got 1,000 things wrong. Okay, now what do? I've got to research 1,000 different things and figure out how to fix them. And so that's another thing that Trava tool does, is for every vulnerability you click in, it'll tell you exactly where it is in your system, how to find it. They'll tell you what the threat is, what the impact is. And in most cases, there'll be references. If it's a known CVE, what's called, there'll be references for you to read more about it. And then if there is a known solution or a patch or whatever, it'll be right there. You don't have to go anywhere else to figure out how to fix it. I think the other challenge that companies face in trying to put together a legitimate vulnerability management program is how much time, like man hours, do they have to work on this? And so that's where kind of the criticality rating comes in, that you can't necessarily get rid of 100% of your vulnerabilities. It's not realistic for a variety of reasons. Could be manpower, could be just cost, could be legacy systems that have vulnerabilities that aren't able to be updated or whatever. There's a variety of situations. The point is, it helps to have prioritization based on criticality. So you just you don't get overwhelmed, but you steadily work your way down the list of priorities.
So now that you've talked about the different challenges people typically face, what are some tips that you would recommend them?
Number one is don't get overwhelmed, especially when you get your first vulnerability report. We've had customers that we've run the first vulnerability report and the vulnerabilities number in the thousands. And so usually our first job is to talk them down off the ledge and say, don't worry about it. We're going to get through this. It really is that let's just focus on the most critical ones first and look at, okay, what's the level of effort? We sometimes use the term bang for the buck, like how many vulnerabilities can we get rid of how many of the most critical vulnerabilities can we get rid of with the least amount of effort or the least amount of expenditure, that kind of thing. And you just slowly start. It's all progress is good progress. So you just start getting better. Kind of like taking up an exercise program. You don't start an exercise program by going out and trying to run a marathon or swim 5 miles. You go for a walk.
All right, Jim, I've learned a lot about vulnerability management and how it's fundamental to compliance. But before we wrap up the episode, is there anything else you would like to talk about when it comes to vulnerability management or compliance, or even just general cybersecurity?
I think kind of the themes that we had throughout the podcast today, Jared, really where we ended up. The most important things are don't be afraid, almost like going to a doctor. If something's wrong, go to the doctor, get the diagnosis. We'll worry about how we're going to fix it later. So get that first vulnerability scan done. You know what, don't have it. Don't bury your head in the sand and think I'll worry about this later. We talked about it on another podcast. Don't take the attitude that the cyber criminal, I'm just a small business. Cyber criminals aren't going to be interested in me. I don't have any data worth stealing. Not true. So get that vulnerability assessment done, and then really take a deep breath and say, okay, I can't fix everything, but I can fix something.
Thanks so much for your time and insights, Jim. I'm sure the listeners got as much out of this episode as I did. Thanks.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. Thank you.
Now that we've spilled the tea, it's time to go over the receipts. Jim did a great job at helping me understand vulnerability management and why it's important to compliance. And I took 4 key things from this conversation. Not that there wasn't more to talk about, but I took 4 key things away. Number one, vulnerability management involves finding and fixing things that could be exploited by hackers. Another thing that Jim stressed is that vulnerability management is fundamental. It's critical for all compliance frameworks and regulations. As he mentioned throughout the episode, you can't protect what you don't know. So you can't be compliant with something if you don't know the vulnerabilities that are standing in your way from being the most secure that you could be. Another thing that I took away is that it's essential to conduct vulnerability management continuously. You cannot do this just like every once in a while. It goes back into something we talked about in a previous episode about being proactive. So if you're continuously looking for vulnerabilities and things of that nature, it'll help you know what you need to do to keep your business and your customers' data as secure as possible. And the last thing that I took away from this conversation with Jim is just don't get overwhelmed. As he mentioned, sometimes when you run vulnerability scans that it may be overwhelming seeing what you have open that people can weasel their way into. But again, like most things, you have to start somewhere. So when it comes to getting into vulnerability management, just keep calm. You can get help from the Trava team, but just don't get overwhelmed. Again, we all have to start somewhere, like this podcast, helping us all understand cybersecurity and compliance. That wraps this episode of the Tea on Cybersecurity. I'll see you in the next one. And that's the Tea on Cybersecurity. If you like what you listen to, please leave a review. If you need anything else from me, head on over to Trava Security. Follow wherever you get your podcasts.